Museum. Thanks to Brian and Vivian Ferguson, we've been open on Saturdays and Sundays, and 2 weeks ago we had 69 on Saturday and 69 on Sunday. It's wonderful because not only do you have more visitors, they donate more and you sell more books, so. and a few memberships too. So thanks to all the volunteers, especially the people who come out on a Saturday and Sunday. Just before I introduce the speaker, I'll say that the next talk is on the 14th of March. It's Claire Simpson, who lives in England, and it'll be on the 14th of March just to suit her travel arrangements. And she'll be talking about the Neville Chamberlain's sisal plantation on Andros. So that's Thursday the 14th. Right, our guest speaker. I first met him in 1982 when we received archaeology training right in this hall from Julian Granbury. And we had a wonderful time going around the island, and it was Neil's son who discovered the first Lucayan piece of pottery. Remember that? Yeah.
On this island. On this island.
On this island, yeah. At Nirvana.
Yeah.
Somewhere over there.
Xanadu.
Xanadu. Then again, when I taught social studies at the College of the Bahamas, he was in the chair of the social science division. He was born in Lancashire, in England. His mother is Barbadian and his father is English, and he grew up in between the West Indies and England. His higher education he received at Oxford University with an MA in Geography, and at London University on a scholarship, the Leverhulme Open Fellowship. He had a short career as an officer in the British Merchant Navy and the Royal Navy Reserve. Subsequently to that, he came to the Bahamas. He was a college lecturer in England and moved to the Bahamas in 1978 to teach at CUB. He was a senior lecturer in geography until 1995, a year after he received his Bahamian citizenship. He's widely published in journals, newspapers and magazines. He's the author of a number of textbooks and atlases, including Bahamian Landscapes and the Bahamas Today. We've got to go right back to 1992 for his last presentation on Columbus's landfall. Tonight, he will present an illustrated review of Bahamian books printed before 1960. I have pleasure in introducing Neil Sealey.
So after that introduction, some of you may be wondering what I'm doing talking about books, because there was nothing to suggest that I absolutely knew anything about books at all. But when you get to write, produce magazines, write in magazines, do an editorial, and end up doing textbooks, which bring you into contact with publishers, you get to know a little bit about publishing. And as you heard, in 1995 I left the college to join local company Media Enterprises, where I'm still working today, and included until a few hours ago. And we started a publishing arm at Media Enterprises, and as a result of publishing a few books, one of which I'll show you this evening, we got asked by local businesses to supply them with other books besides the ones we published. In other words, books that they were normally buying from publishers in the UK, particularly because they weren't getting them easily. And it so happened that as I thought, well, it'd be a good idea, let's get a box of these books and sell them along with our books. Maybe we'll get more business to sell the books we are publishing. The next thing, we end up being a wholesaler of books for Bahamian shops. Wholesale out of the business, mainly in the retail, and those of you that have any involvement in business activities will recognize that it's rare that wholesale and retail go together in the same operation. And so I ended up being a wholesale bookseller, and the retail booksellers buy books from us. So that gets me into books, okay? Selling books, and I keep getting calls for books that I can't buy from a publisher. And when I was first thinking about this talk, which was about 6 months ago, and I thought, you know, it's a long time since I talked to the society. It was like 20 years last year. I thought, you know, this is something every month a couple of people are ringing me up and asking me about some old book, and I have to go through a whole rigmarole of explaining, you know, why it's out of print, what out of print means, how you might get one, and how you mightn't be able to get the original, get a reprint, and so on. So, today I got 2 calls about old books, so it's not really 2 calls a month. It may be 1 or 2 calls a day, every day. So I'm hoping that I can seed you all now. You can spread the word about old books, out of print, facsimiles, reprints, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight in the context, of course, of Bahamian books, because this is what we're focused on. And by way of starting, and check everything's working all right. There we go. Maybe we can have that light off a little. I don't think I want anyone reading anyway. I've said it. We'll probably need a light in the front rather than a light in the back, because I'm going to hold up some books. Maybe you can work that out. Well, you'll see when I hold up a book and you can figure out what the best thing to do. By way of introducing myself, I do read most of these books. I can't claim to have read all of them, but I've read an awful lot of the books, that both the ones I'm going to show you and some on the back table, which today will be for sale with a contribution to the Historical Society. And some of the ones I show you as well, I'll put on the table at the back, but some of them aren't for sale. They're just the only copy that's available at the time. Some people here are probably collectors and they have original copies as well. And the one that I wanted to start with is The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands by Catesby. But a couple of reasons for this. This is one of the oldest books that are extant on the Bahamas. It's a specific theme. It's the history of the Bahamas. It's also an extremely valuable book. You'll see in the note there, I checked just before I came. If you've got deep pockets, there's one for $350,000 and one for $500,000. Some years ago, let's say about 20 years ago, I was at the John Carter Brown Library, which is at Brown University, and is a major library in the United States. It only collects books up to the beginning of the 20th century. Of this book, the plates in the book, there's one of them there, are all hand-colored, and the attractiveness of seeing the 2 of them, they brought them out for me and they made them side by side, and you wear gloves and all this kind of thing, and I was able to turn them over and see the slight differences for whoever had done the colouring of the illustrations in each volume. At that time, I found there was a copy for sale for $250,000, and one of the members, who was then director of the archives, I mentioned it to her. I said, you know, this would be an ideal thing for the archives, but Dr. Saunders. So I'm afraid we haven't got one that I know of in the country, but they do exist in Rhode Island there. Unfortunately, although you can get copies, and there was mostly what they've done is they've taken out the plates, or the books have fallen apart and the plates have been taken out separately, so that what has happened is that on my computer things look a bit differently. These are coming out a bit dark. What happens between the next computer you use and the projector you use, colors change a little bit. I've tried to keep the contrast high so as we don't have too many conflicts in the appearance. But those of you who've done this will understand what I'm talking about. So the pictures are actually brighter and not quite so dark as you see in the presentation here. But you see the kind of price that some of these are going for. And I think on the first slide it said there were, what, 220 of these plates? So that you can see that you can get quite a lot from just selling the plates on the open market at the present time. Now this is where we will need some light on me. You can compensate by getting some pretty good I'm just picking at random. There's fish, it's not all birds. You see there's other animals there, there's a turtle, and so on. So this was a collection, as it says, watercolours from the Royal Library at Windsor Castle. There's one on the front. It's a famous book, all right? So there have been exhibitions of it, and in this case, this book is available. And another book that I came across is Catesby's Birds, where they concentrated on the birds. They've got one on the cover. There aren't too many coloured pictures, but there are some at the beginning. There's one of them. There's some more. But they have reproductions of the contents of the birds throughout the book. Okay. So it's nice to have a dramatic start, because that really is an exceptional book by any standards, and it's all about the Bahamas. Well, it's substantially about the Bahamas, even though it includes the rest of North America. So, at this point I wanted to say a little bit about, as it says, editions, reprints, and facsimiles, because not all books are equal these days, and things have changed a lot, even in the short time that I've been in this business. Here is an example. In fact, this is a better one. This is an original old book, and Guide to the Bahamas, and it's quite expensive. We're talking over $100 for a book like that. This is The Land of the Pink Pearl, also a pretty expensive book. This has been recovered. This is the only copy I've ever come across personally, although I know that people in the Bahamas do have copies of The Land of the Pink Pearl, which is an excellent book. And the inscription on this says it's been deleted from the Belfast Library in Northern Ireland. It's in pretty good shape, but collectors would balk at it because they wouldn't like a new binding on it, or it's an old binding obviously, but it's not the original binding. When I first went to Media Enterprises, this was one of the books that I liked very much, having read it, and thought it would be very useful if more people had access to it. So we produced this book. So this is a new edition of an old book. So we have the original book, and now we have a new edition in which I actually did a little bit of research in London on the author and put an introduction in which encompassed that. This book is now sold out and is out of print like the original. So we've got an original out of print, a later edition out of print, but in the nature of things, and because of the great improvements in technology, there are now facsimiles available. So this is a facsimile of the page. They tend to do them in one size fits all. So you'll see that the original book is this format, but it's actually reproduced in that format. Sometimes they enlarge the page, but basically you can compare them for yourself. Yes, they've enlarged it there, you can see. But so a machine does this, and they've done hundreds of thousands of old books, literally. And they put bland covers on which have got absolutely nothing to do with the contents, except the title. But you'll see this because I'm going to hold more of them up for you. So there are some disadvantages in it. In the case of The Land of the Pink Pearl, there's only one illustration, which is right at the front of a silk cotton tree. And it's quite nicely reproduced in this facsimile. You'll also see, you can probably notice here, there are handwritten remarks on the page. So the copy that they got, remember some of these will be quite difficult to get, the copy that the publisher got, whatever blemishes or additions will all be reproduced because it's a facsimile. They put it in a machine and it copies it. And they put it between two covers and they sell it. And you'll find them all over Amazon. And if you're looking for a book, don't think you found The Land of the Pink Pearl for $40, all right? What you found is a facsimile. And Amazon and that is now swamped with these for anything which purportedly was published before 1923. There's The Land of the Pink Pearl. We can't actually see the original cover, but as you can see, it was a pretty dark cover to start with. But my blue cover has come out this kind of murky color, and you get the idea between new and old editions. And there, in fact, is the facsimile. I wanted to point out a couple of things about these facsimiles because it's quite important in our access to old books about the Bahamas. You can probably read this, but the point is 1923. They have determined by some magic mathematical process that if someone wrote a book before 1923, they've now been dead for 50 years and they can legitimately publish it because international law says it's out of copyright if the author's been dead for 50 years. If you do a little bit of maths, you can easily figure out that someone could easily have written a book in 1923 and been alive at the present time. In other words, at least not alive at the present, but been 50 years at the present time. He will have lived a bit longer. I mean, he might have written the book when he was 20, right? And if he then lived another 50 years, he would have been going to 1973, and that's only 40 years ago. Right? So they've taken a bit of a liberty with it. And the second thing is, they lie, all right? Because there's a book on Inagua, which some of you may know. There it is. There's one copy of it anyway, by Gilbert Klingel, which was published in 1944. They've made facsimiles of that as well, all right? So there's no way that, you know, that's 20 years after 1923. And they're claiming that this is, and it actually says on the website, you know, as this book was published before 1923, it's out of copyright. And it isn't, and I doubt it's out of copyright. I don't imagine that Klingel has been dead for 50 years. And then they have a little bit up there, which is a little bit harder to read, but it says, in the interest of creating a more extensive selection of rare historical book reprints, we've chosen to reproduce this title. Now the rest is what's really matters. Even though it may possibly have occasional imperfections, such as missing and blurred pages, missing text, poor pictures, markings, dark backgrounds, and other reproduction issues beyond our control. It's not really beyond their control at all. It's beyond the machine they're using to control. And the fact that they actually do hundreds of thousands of these and not simply one at a time. Now there are some reproductions that come out that universities, scholars, specialty publishers and so on have reproduced. You might qualify Media Publishing's version of this as an example of that. So you can do it, and there are others around that are not just bland. On the other hand, I would say in their favor, the facsimiles are getting better. And I'll show you later on an example of an older and a newer facsimile so you can judge for yourself. Looking now, having kind of introduced the whole idea of old books in the Bahamas, they tend to fall into certain themes, of which mostly what you'd expect. The straightforward history books, although the history books often overlap with the guidebooks. So you find that the Bahamas Handbook by Mary Moseley has an awful lot of history in it, and Stark's history is very much a guide to things you want to see in the Bahamas and Nassau. We've mentioned Mark Catesby. You tend to get a lot of recollections and that kind of thing of people who visited the Bahamas and wrote their memories of it. And they often have something like Isles of Summer, Isles of June, Summerland, something like that in the title. There's specific events, of which the murder of Sir Harry Oakes will be our concluding. That'll be a cue when we're getting to the end of this. There's a big event of which many people wrote specifically on that particular topic. So that crops up as well. There's biographies, and I haven't really mentioned much in the sense of fiction, but people do write stories, poetry, or include artwork in books about the Bahamas. So that covers most of the books. You'll find that there's exceptions to that list. And here is what to start off with, because it's a little bit of an oddity, but fits in with what we were talking about, original books and reprints. The memoirs of Peter Henry Bruce, lying around here a minute ago, if I can find it. No, it's not that one. No. Memoirs of Bruce. Anyway, I'll find it in a minute. Oh, here it is. Nope, it's not that one.
It's a slim one.
It's like that.
I saw it on your.
Yeah, it might be over there. It's a bulky red book. That book is quite old. It was produced in 1782, right here, and there was a reprint, which is quite cheap. We have a copy here. No.
That's the original.
No. No. It's Memoirs of Bruce. It's a thick red book like that. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. There was a reprint, 1949, on the handout that you've got. But he only did 500 copies, and he illustrated that is an oddity. The reprint is probably now as rare as the original. But the original has been reprinted as the Memoirs of Bruce. What happened with the Bahamian Interlude reprint? Only part of this book is about the Bahamas. And I thought I'd just read the first few lines of this. I'm not going to read from many books, but I did make a note of this. And also you can then see how much of the book is actually about the Bahamas. This isn't about the Bahamas, this is. But it's about 80 pages. And just in the first few lines, you'll get an idea of what you're going to hear or read if you follow it. The 1st of July 1740, I was appointed chief engineer at 20 shillings per day. I set out from Scotland on the 8th of August, arrived at the 16th, and having received my award, Lord John Tinker, Esquire, Governor of the Bahamas, and so on, sir. That was what he did. Like commissions the work at a very early stage, so we do have access to that. In fact, a quite, fortunately, the more specialty account, which was illustrated, is now. Now getting into a kind of chronological system of the books which I've found and asked for, which is mainly how you learn about them, apart from the occasional bibliography you find, which is fairly thorough. You can see this is 1823, but there aren't many that are before 1850s. It's really the from the 1850s, in fact the 1870s, that we see most of the titles. And in fact there's quite a flurry once we get into the last quarter of the 19th century. I'll see which ones I can show you up here. The Atlantic, I've sold the Isla is here. This is how very nicely the original book was done, with a stamped blue cover. They didn't have dust covers in those days, so that you either get a plain cover, maybe with some lead on it, which this is a typical example, or you get something which is embossed in this way. And it's in this case with not with photographs, either with wood engravings or lithographs. There's one example, and I'll show you some dimensions, one of the earlier books. You notice the bland format that a lot of these have. There's another example, which is showing you the Atlantic Islands, which is quite an interesting read, and I had the opportunity to scan one of the pages, and it showed there are people sorting sponges there, although it's not reproduced very well on this projector. And this is the Isles of Summer that I was talking about. You've seen the engravings, and these are the lithographs. There's some more information about the book there. Very detailed contents, which was the style of the time. They didn't always have indexes, but the contents, if you worked through them, you could find what was going to turn up in each contents, rather than the few words that you get in the modern contents. And here's an example, a lithograph, which used the lithograph format for drawings of materials like the sponges that he's got in that, and other things like fish and birds and plants and that sort of thing. Whereas if it was something more of a landscape, he used the wood engraving, of which this is an example. And having a geographical background, I'm always interested in the original pictures of the glass windows, what that is. And Oh, and it is available. It is available as a facsimile. And I was going to show you the picture here that I showed you in the other book, so as you could compare it, if I can get it to open at the right page. This is its contents. They've enlarged it so it's a little bit easier to read. There we have the reproduction of the, I guess it's a lithograph. No, it's probably a wood engraving. A wood engraving of the map of the Bahamas. So that's the Islands of Summer. It's a good book. It's well worth reading and looking at the pictures. The birds of the Bahama Islands, I've only got a facsimile of it. As you see, they're all the same size and they have these sort of meaningless covers. The pictures came out fairly poorly. There's Bird and Annie. It should be a lot sharper than that. At one time we did have an original copy of this. Here's another picture of a bird which doesn't come out too well at all. That's the sooty tern. Well, it's certainly sooty, but it doesn't look very terny, so you can judge for yourself. Now, the first time I saw the birds of the Bahamas was the original, and one of our members really introduced me to the whole idea of getting someone who's spoken to you in the past, and I'm sure you all know her. She's in the audience tonight. And she said, well, you know, why don't we get some of these books together and sell them? And she actually provided quite a lot of them for me, of which the original Birds of the Bahamas, which was quite an expensive book, when I checked before this talk, original copies were in the $500 to $1,000 range. I believe Virginia donated her book to College of the Bahamas Library, certainly to a library somewhere. So if you want to see the original, it's in the library, see Virginia. In the meanwhile, you can get you can get the text, but the pictures are going to be pretty murky in this reproduction. Moving on, Stark's History of the Bahamas, which is, Stark was one of these guys who went around the Caribbean, and he wrote history of quite a few islands. I think he did one of Barbados, I think he did one of St. Lucia, I'm sure he did one of Jamaica. And once you get into Stark's history on the internet, you'll find all the other titles. But he did a pretty good study of the Bahamas, and I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this because this is one of the ones where we've got two levels of facsimile. The first one that came out was this, with another kind of non-representative cover, as you can see. And then again another one with some kind of clock on the front, whatever, maybe that's supposed to represent history. But it is well illustrated, and it included photographs and drawings. There's the Bendu house that's on the slide. There's a photograph. There are lots of photographs in here. Now that's something I was going to read to you. But this is one of the sponge trimmers to show that he's quite happy to have drawings of people doing things. Some books, they tend to only have landscape, physical attributes or natural history, but some of them have a more sociological content, and Stark was one of the people who actually said what people were doing and you know, how they behaved and that sort of thing. And you'll see even with the glass window bridge, he's got some people in the picture. So I quite like him. And one of the things that I did come across when I was reading this book, which I thought was worth repeating, no description can give an adequate idea of the lake of fire at Waterloo, and no effect of phosphorescence ordinarily seen, even in the tropics, can suggest even the faintest notion of it. He goes on to say where he's seen other phosphorescence, but here the most curious part of the whole affair is that it cannot be accounted for. The lake, which is artificial, was constructed for the purpose of storing turtles. The bed is cut out of solid colored rock, And so he goes on. He says later on that you can read a newspaper at night by the light of the phosphorescence. I'm told there are still phosphorescence in Waterloo. I don't know if any of you have been there.
I thought I was wondering when Coke
So fairly early on, there was a reproduction in this size. There's the Vendu house again. But you can see from this reproduction, it's pretty washed out when you get to the sponge cutters. Whereas the later one, in this regular large format, has a much better reproduction of the illustrations. And the point is, if you're getting a facsimile, not all facsimiles are the same. The original photo was a little bit light, all right? And this is a pretty good reproduction of the original. It's also enlarged a bit as well. So that's Stark's history. Now we have to move on from the 19th century to the early 20th century, of which these are some of the more important titles at the top, and some more specific titles further down. But Sketches of Summerland and the Bahama Islands are quite notable books at the very beginning of the century. This is one of the reproductions of the Sketches of Summerland. As you can easily recognize now, you know what the facsimiles look like. Despite the fact it's a fairly recent one, this was a map, and you can see that they didn't do a very good job of it. It just got all scrunched up in the machine and nothing happened. This was a fold-out map of which they got a bit of it, but the rest of New Providence is lost. This is just the eastern end that survived. And somebody spilled ink on their copy, so we got that as well. Nevertheless, it's a 1900 book, so even though I'm criticizing them, we're still getting something which many of us might not be able to see except in the library. One of my favorite books, as you can probably guess, the Bahama Islands, although I didn't put it on here. It's written by the Baltimore Geographical Society. It's this book here. And it was produced in 1905, and the Baltimore Geographical Society sent an expedition to the Bahamas with a whole team of people. It's got stuff about magnetism in it, it's got stuff about fish, it's got the geological history, the meteorology and the climate and so on, the vegetation. It's a pretty interesting book, and I haven't read every article in it, but quite a lot of them. And I thought I'd show you a couple of these. This is a map here of Eleuthera.
The red soil.
They kind of got a gold color for the tone of it, and it has nice plates of fish which are colored. There has been some, there's another one, there are color plates throughout. It's a pretty hefty book. It has fold out, in this case, a kind of genealogical table, which shows the links between everyone. And just recently, I found that this reproduced, a suitably hefty size. This is what the map of Eleuthera I showed you came out as. For some reason, it's upside down. They obviously aren't very good at proofreading. This Cat Island, it's also upside down. It's not upside down in the original, which is why I took the trouble to show it to you. And of course, you don't get color. I'm sure that eventually we will get color illustrations in the facsimiles, but it hasn't happened yet. So there's the fish that I showed you. It comes out as a fairly uninteresting black and white fish. Nevertheless, it's an important book, And my attention was first drawn to it when I was giving students assignments at the college. I would sometimes get some very strange descriptions of the Bahamas coming up, about us being the coral tops of volcanic peaks rising from the Atlantic Ocean and this kind of stuff. And I said, well, where'd you get this? They said, oh, it's in the geography book in the library. It was in this book in the library. They didn't actually look at the date of the book, you know, that it was 80 years old. And they didn't get everything right in there, all right? This is also the book that's a bit notorious about inbreeding in the family animals, notably abaco, which was fairly rapidly disproved by other sociologists who took exception to what was said in that book. That's a whole nother story, but I didn't want to duck the issue because it keeps cropping up every time I mention book. Oh, that's the book which showed all these pictures of deformed people and things. But the reality is it was nothing exceptional. And so there's some other books that I found. It's easier to find all these now, I think. Now we're getting a little bit lower down the pile. One of them I picked out because they're often quite lengthy articles as opposed to independent books. And this is the Annals of the Carnegie Museum. Goes back quite a way, we're talking about 1911, but it has a substantial article at the end, a contribution to the Bahama Islands. And it's quite a lengthy article, it's not just a few pages. So if you're an ornithologist, this is something which would be of interest. Another book which I'm not going to hold up is Wonders of the Deep, but it speaks for itself. The Little Book of the Sea Gardens, I've occasionally had some original copies of that. There is a facsimile there, and the same with the Folk Tales of Andros. Going back a little bit, there's the sketches of Summerland, which I held up to you earlier, but it shows you the title page in the book, which is nicely engraved with a collage of different things, the Columbus statue and so on. This is from the Bahama Islands, the map of Cat Island in that book that I held up for you, and the fish, but I also included this map which shows you the hurricane tracks up to that time, the scientific detail that was included in the book, and rather unusually they included this is a mean track. So not only did they describe the tracks, but they analyzed them within the resources of the time to show a mean track, which is accurate. That's pretty much where Floyd went and Hugo and those hurricanes that skirted along the edge of the Bahama Islands and gave us all a swipe and then went up and hit the Caribbean. So it's pretty interesting, and as I said, for a researcher, it's definitely a mine of information. And this also is interesting, especially given the introduction that Jim gave us on archaeology, because the things we learned very early on is that Lucayan skulls were flattened at the front by boards based on the infants' heads right after birth, because they thought, presumably, according to the archaeologists, this was attractive. A modern skull goes straight up, and if you ever see them side by side, you know. But all this is in the book, and some of these pictures and some of the articles have been reproduced and used many times, because they're really extremely useful. I'm told this skull might still be around somewhere. Also, that I mentioned, the ornithology contribution. This one I put in because I mentioned the Wonders of the Deep, which I don't have here, but when I did have it, I noticed that the facsimile was unreadable. I think the machine made a fault. I'm sure the book wasn't actually printed like that copy. And these are two of the other books of which facsimiles have been made. I put there older facsimiles, reproductions, and they didn't follow the companies like Nabu and the others. By the way, the publishers' names are on the handout you've got if you want to pursue them. And as I said, if you go to their own websites, you'll find that you've got 100 pages of fine print, like a telephone directory of all the titles they've done. So on to the fairly more into the 20th century, a couple of oddities. Satan, which is a novel, a romance of the Bahamas, a letter from the Bahama Islands. This actually was produced in 1923, but it's a book that's actually 100 years older than that, from 1823. This is it here. This is the 1923 copy, which they must have made quite a few copies of it. I haven't seen the 1823 one or where they got it, but someone, even that long ago, was interested in maintaining the content and putting it back in circulation. But much more important is the Bahama Handbook of 1926, of which this is a copy. They're not too easy to get, but they do exist. And I wanted to move on to a display from it. These are some of the books I mentioned. This was the Satan book, Intervention Providence, Letters of the Bahama Islands, and this is the Bahamas Handbook. There's been no fact of it. I'm not quite sure why I haven't caught up with it, because it is, well, it is 1926, but we found out that doesn't really stop them. It has a large number of photographs and maps, and has sections, as you might expect in any guidebook, geography book, history book, or so on. This is a copy of it, an example of its photographs and its fold-out maps, which in this case are intact, as you can see. When they do a fact, I'm not sure how they'll handle that. And rather than just hold up the book, I did copy some of the pictures, and you can see that in this case, with the sisal field, it's in the Berry Islands. So if I'd known you're going to have the talk when I was actually preparing this, maybe I could have found a sisal in Andros. This is a pineapple field, one pair of photographs on the page. These two, Old Baptist Chapel, San Salvador, and Arthurstown, San Salvador. That will probably trigger some query in your mind, because of course in 1996, San Salvador became Cat Island, and of course that's where Arthurstown is. So we're actually on what we now know as Cat Island, but it was Watlings Island and San Salvador rather than San Salvador and Cat Island. F. Armbruster of Nassau. And the subtitle of this book is Being Adventurous with the Negro. And of course that attracts a lot of people who want to look back at the more sociological aspect of the Bahamas in slavery, in the post-slavery period, and in the colonial period. And Amelia set out to have a look, and most of her pictures are of people and activities. And so it's a much quoted book. And again, I thought I'd say a couple of things from it. What I found when I was looking at it and remembering that I'd enjoyed reading it, and it's not a hard read at all. It's sociological. It's an adventure. She came over here and got into it. The person who wrote the foreword says, "How a girl brought up soft in London, who never see, went through with such a life, fair gets me beat." She was in women, and including going off on fishing boats and mail boats, which you know, would be quite an adventure today. I'll just read a little bit. She's gone off on the boat with, I think, the wife of the governor and 2 children, and she says, "I was taught with fear, but all the crew and passengers seemed very happy. The 2 white babies slept in the cabin, and their mother watched them while it rose and fell with the motion of suddenly rough sea. I was very ill, and she was at intervals. The vessel was overrun with rats and cockroaches. I lay out on the deck for the 5 nights when it rained. I was afraid of falling overboard, and a woman, the wife of a sponger, because it was a spongy boat, made of her body a railing. So you can picture this adventurous lady from London, brought up soft, on a boat, a sponge boat, heading off down the tongue of the ocean with all sorts of characters on board, and perhaps stopping to let people off along the way. It hasn't been copied, as I'm aware. Another somewhat similar book, written by another lady of note, Rosita Force, who actually made a home in Governor's Harbour, a travel writer, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa of her time. And I understand that she was actually asked to write a book about the Bahamas because they make it more attractive for tourists. And in looking at the book, with my keen eye, I noticed that there's an awful lot of pictures with palm trees in them. You know, is that something that we haven't got away from just yet? Oh, there's another one. So I think it was something in the nature of a travelogue. It happens that she was actually a pretty good writer, and A Unicorn in the Bahamas is a pretty rare book these days. It hasn't been copied. It's quite entertaining to read, and I guess we can let her off the hook even though she was writing a travel book, because she did in fact invest in the Bahamas. Oh, and in the front piece I forgot another picture. So she's not big like Amelia on individual people, but she does have a few pictures in them. I suspect that she got a picture to her by whoever was in charge of tourism or the civil servant that was looking at her at the time. And she does describe being in the so she really doesn't want to leave there. And I think she called it Unicorn Key. Some of their French levers today. So that was A Unicorn in the Bahamas. One of the last books was Islands in the Sun, which is about the copy over there. It's not a technical book, but in Islands in the Sun, her first chapters of the whole of the Caribbean are about the Bahamas. Either it's because she was living here and she loved it, or we're quite prominent in it, and she has a selection of pictures as well as the Caribbean. Moving on further into the 20th century and towards the end of our chronological journey, I mentioned by Gilbert Klingle. This is the American novelist who went out alongside town and found in Matthewtown, got himself rescued as a result, much because he wanted to study. The main book, 50 pages, is a wartime edition at the time. In saving papers, fairly print with narrow line that says on it that he could the War Office of saving the British economy in the Second War. It's been reprinted many times. This is a window. There must be about 4 or 5. I have no idea if they were all over the place. The media has sold some new paperback. They were out, but then they've gone out of print, and these are available at this cost. I'm going to come back to these books that I got from Inagua. There's a donkey actually working, as opposed to the wild donkeys that tourists like to photograph now, in Inagua. And he was also, being a biologist, given to fairly detailed captions and a fairly flowery language. The leaf note has a yet human-like face, even a little bit dark. You can see that he's got the teeth pretty well. And then he shows the nighthawk. By day it drowsed, going out in the evening to feed with bats and owls. He's quite, although I was told by an Inaguan native, you have to take what he writes in some parts of the book with a pinch of salt, because when he says he tramped 6 miles to get to this place, they say, oh, that's a Klingle mile, that's not a real mile. So I think maybe he kind of exaggerated things. Nevertheless, there aren't many books written about Inagua, and it's nice to know that we've got that one and that it's kept in so well. This is another book about a particular activity, not a particular place, but a group of them, the Lighthouses of the Bahamas. The book's getting increasingly hard to find. It's a fairly small book. It's written by the naval officer who was sent to the Bahamas by the colonial government to manage the lighthouses. And this book is all about managing the lighthouses. He has this cartoon in the front, which, because it's, he wrote it at the time, we're talking about the 1940s there, the German, jumped a bit here, that's the wrong button. We want that, let's see if we can go back. He's got here, you see the cross of the German nation there, not quite a swastika, on lightships and the Bahamians, and they're called the Volta in this book. And this is him at work. This was the 10th Bahama. He looked after the boys as well as the buoys, as they say in this side of the Atlantic. And this was his whaler. He got ashore from the schooner, and some of his adventures actually getting ashore, particularly at Hole in the Wall in Abaco, are quite remarkable, because there can be quite a sea running there ashore in that little wooden boat, which is propelled by oars, as you can see, with the commander sitting at the stern, flying the flag, in naval fashion. It's quite an attractive read. And there is a more modern book written now called Last Lights, about these in their last days, unless they're preserved, which fits in quite nicely with this, which of course deals with them in a fundamental part for navigation in the Bahamas. So, the book, this is specifically about Bahamian stamps, with the appropriate detail that the stamp collectors welcome. I don't know that there are any other books on Bahamian stamp collecting. And one of the biographies, earlier on that there were biographies, some of the history books are something like a biography, like Rosita Forbes, but this one is a biography as opposed to an autobiography, and there's more than one book written about him, but this one is a pretty readable one with a nice catchy title, The Hermit of Cat Island. And it's, his name was Father Jerome Hawes, and he's the monk, to the Anglican faith, became a Roman Catholic, built both the churches in Clarencetown. One, the Anglican, and then later on, when he came back to the Bahamas, the Roman Catholic Church. And he spent his last days at St.